Hello, I'm Mary Gage, and I wrote the play Fallout. What would you do if you discovered you had killed 100,000 people? After Major Claude Eatherly took part in the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, he refused to march in the Heroes Parade, or accept a hero's pension. He was desperate to prove he was not a hero, so he started holding up banks and forging checks in an effort to send money to the children of Hiroshima. His exploits made him world famous, and he stirred up every shade of opinion, from Colonel Tibbets, who called him a traitor, to Gunther Anders, who thought madness was the only sane reaction. My play follows Eatherly's wild ride from ace World War II pilot to inmate of a maximum security mental hospital and witness of present-day US defense policy. It's both urgent and relevant as the world hovers dangerously once more on the brink of nuclear war. I'm really delighted that Sajay Samuel is doing talks around this play, and his second discussion is on the dangers of technology in the nuclear age, this time with Karl Mitcham from the School of Mines, and I'm very happy to introduce both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm Sajay Samuel, Clinical Professor of Accounting at Penn State University. I'm grateful that Professor Karl Mitcham has made time to participate in this conversation about whether man is obsolete in the nuclear age. As it will become clear later, the title of our conversation pays homage to the first philosopher to fully take up the question of the atomic bomb. Karl Mitcham is himself a philosopher of technology who's now affiliated with the Colorado School of Mines and the Renmin University in China. For almost 50 years, half a century, he's been cutting a path between engineering and technology and philosophy as he thought through the question of technology. He's a master geographer whose maps of how to think about technology are indispensable. And with the threat of nuclear war looming, I can think of none better to help us understand this perilous moment in history. Karl, so thank you very, very much for making the time, as I've said earlier. It's an honor, it's a pleasure, and we're grateful to have the occasion to perhaps engage you in conversation on the question of nuclear war and the role people can play or not play in that context. The first question I'd like us to lead off with is whether one understands nuclear weapons to be a different means of war in kind, or is it simply a matter of degree, more dangerous? Are nuclear weapons to conventional war of bombs like automatic guns are to pistols, or is it completely of a different kind?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting me to this conversation, Sajay. And it's a pleasure to see Mary again, too, here in this conversation. I think that in a way, it's sort of obvious that people run away from the obvious, of course, often too. But engineering is a new kind of making. It's done with the use of science and becomes a more powerful way of transforming and conquering nature, and then produces technologies. And in a way, all the technologies that are produced by engineering have a character that's quite different from artisanal production or craft production, hand production. They're different in their origins because engineering doesn't connect with the world through our sensory motor perceptive abilities. It connects to the world through the world is mediated through machines and instruments like the microscope and the telescope that puts the world, the physical world, the lived world at a distance. So as soon as we start engineering, we are creating both a new world of artifice within which human beings live that is very different than the world of craft building, vernacular architecture, the home, the hearth. And so there's a first step right there. But then when we start engineering instruments of mass destruction, like the atomic bomb, and the first really engineered mass destruction was chemical weapons during the First World War. We're entering a new phase of the technologies of living with things that we can't relate to directly, that influence, impact the world, and confuse us in our relationship to the world. And I think the atomic bomb serves as a kind of iconic or uniquely revealing. It reveals with a kind of luminosity that chemical weapons didn't, and because of its all-at-once explosive power, that it becomes an icon that the chemical weapons, the phosgene gas during the First World War couldn't. It was this, it was simply a cloud diffusing through the lines. But the atomic bomb, I would describe as a kind of icon of destruction. We use it as that now.
Yeah.
And as an icon, it's revealing of a new kind of reality, which it's the techno, rather than the techno life world in which we live, it's the techno death world in which we are now living. But it's always hard to get our wrap our mind around something as transforming as the atomic bomb.
So if I hear you correctly and understand you correctly, the potter who makes in traditional crafts, in the world of traditional craftsmen, the potter is working with clay and a potter's wheel to make a pot. There is something of a direct relationship between the potter, the wheel, and the clay and the pot that emerges.
Right.
And in that sense, the activity of making, which we are also doing in the case of the atom bomb, for example, is continuous. However, in the case of the craftsman's world, there's a direct relationship between the matter, the craft, the activity, and the product. There's a connectivity between what the action is doing and the thing that is produced. Now
you can see and feel the result of the pot. When you engineer an atomic bomb, you cannot see or feel or see what's happening inside the bomb, because it's happening at the atomic scale. Now you can see the results,
yes,
but you can't see the thing made as made. You can only see it when it's in operation and its results.
Right. And thus you have a screen between you and the world, the engineered world, or the engineered artifacts. The composition of engineered artifacts creates a screen between you and the world.
Yes,
is one thing. But now in the case of the atom bomb, you point out that it has attained this iconic status in part because it is so notably a display of death. You talked about techno life worlds built around technology, and this thing is manifestly, as in our poster of Fallout, you have the mushroom cloud. It has become sort of seared into the imagination.
Right. It's the icon of the techno death world.
Right. I've been intrigued by something you wrote to me a couple of days ago, and I'd like you to meditate and explain that a little more, of how one faces, or what one does to confront or to acknowledge or not acknowledge something of this magnitude, a techno death world. You tell the story of what you tell your students.
Yeah. Mary asked the question when she introduced the play, what would you do if you realized you'd contributed to the killing of 100,000 people? And Sajay, when you asked me that same question a couple of days ago, I responded, I already have, and so have you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of us privileged in the West, in the United States, have benefited from colonialism, exploitation, imperialism, massive capitalism, control of the world. We are a very privileged group who have a very privileged life, but it's at the expense of hundreds of thousands and millions of people who are living in both poverty and in the past have died. And in the future are going to die because of what we're doing with climate change. So the real problem is sort of recognizing what we already are ethically. He was sort of our forebearer, but we are ethically, all of us. And when I try to make this case to students in my classes, they're always, especially when I teach at an engineering school, the engineers are always optimistic that, well, we're going to solve the problem. And the capitalists say, well, it's not, global warming is a fake. Technology will solve everything. Engineering, innovation will solve everything. The model I like to use to try to explain our alternatives, once we recognize that we are all executioners and profiting from the world, the techno-death world, is that we're like somebody tied down to a railroad track with a train barreling down toward us. And there are really three options that we have. We can either look away and sort of deny that the train's coming, in hopes, in beliefs that it just can't be. We can be like MacGyver, the universal engineer, the old TV program, and tinker with the chains that are tying us to the track. That we're going to engineer our way out of this disaster. Or we can look face on at the train barreling down on us and try both to appreciate what is happening, ask others to look in the right direction as well, rather than to look away or to waste their time tinkering with the change. And I think of Etherly as somebody who was trying to look directly at the train, but in trying to get other people to look too by his performances. My job as an educator is to try to do it through teaching and writing. I'm not a very good performance artist. I'm not sure I would be able to perform any act that would do it. But in a way, Mary's play is a kind of performance calling on us to look directly at the train barreling down on us.
Yeah. And I think it was the intimation of this stance that you identified, not to ignore and pretend there is a miracle. Either you ignore, you turn your eyes away, whether it's climate change, whether it's the possibility of nuclear disaster, you turn your eyes away, i.e. ignore, or you pretend you can solve this problem with a little more technology, a little more ingenuity, a little more innovation, etc. What you're calling for, this sort of heightened awareness and living in the awareness that something is happening, and perhaps that certainly at an individual level, one can't do very much about it.
Right.
So it is both being aware of what is happening and being aware of one's own relative powerlessness. That's a difficult lesson to learn, I would imagine, right?
Yes. Yeah. You have to admit, you don't know. I don't know what to do other than what little bit I can do by teaching and writing and trying to understand and talking with friends like you about this to raise our own awareness and then sharing our conversation with others.
Yeah, I can imagine exactly. I now understand better. Sorry, you were saying?
No.
I now understand better why Gunther Anders was not favored either by the political establishment or, in fact, by popular opinion. He was a philosopher who attempted to raise awareness in the way that you're talking about. He was the only one, I think, who seriously took up, or the first one to seriously take up the question of the atom bomb, and in fact wrote a book of the title, which I don't think you find it easily in English, The Obsolescence of Man.
Yes.
I wonder.
The book that I like better than that is Hiroshima über alles. Hiroshima is everywhere.
Is everywhere. I wonder, Karl, if you would speak to both the question of who he is, a little bit about what he meant by either Hiroshima is everywhere or the obsolescence of man.
Well, Anders was a member of that special generation in the 1920s in Germany who centered around Heidegger. He was a student of Heidegger, along with Hans Jonas, Hannah Arendt, a number, Karl Marx, a number of others, and was living in a Germany that this is where the Frankfurt social criticism school originated. This was the time of the Bauhaus. So Weimar Germany, the Germany of between the two world wars, the first German republic that was set up after the First World War in Weimar, was a tremendously iconic, vigorous cultural world. And Anders was first made his living as a newspaper man. His name is not Anders. His name is Stern, Gunther Stern. And because of he was such a prolific writer for the German newspapers and he was such a good writer that he was being published a lot. And his newspaper editor said, "Look, we can't, we don't want to have a Jewish name so often in the newspaper. You've got to get a pseudonym." And he said, "Okay, just call me something else. Anders, other. It's just German for other." So he's Gunther Other, nobody else. So every man as other man. And he kept that name as his nom de plume for the rest of his life. But he was driven to it by anti-Semitism. And then he sort of adopted it. He was the other. And after the war, well, he fled to the United States during the war, and he was married first to Hannah Arendt. They both fled together from Germany to France and were interned in a concentration camp in France, and then escaped from there, eventually to the United States. But they got divorced, and he married a concert pianist from Houston, Texas, and returned. He was not German; he was Austrian. Returned to Vienna, and it was just by accident that he just learned about Etherly, because his wife liked to keep in touch with life back in Houston. I don't know why anybody would want to keep in touch with life back in Houston, but she did. And so she subscribed to the Sunday edition of the main Houston newspaper. I think it was the Houston Chronicle.
Okay.
And that would come by ship, 2 or 3 weeks late. And when she was reading, there was a small little article about Etherly, and she called it to her husband, Gunther's attention, and then he took the initiative to write to Etherly. Now, this was after Anders himself had made a visit to Hiroshima. Yeah, Anders was not actually the first philosopher to reflect book length. Karl Jaspers wrote a book, Man in the Atomic Age.
Right.
But Anders was very critical of that book because he thought it was a little bit, I guess, too reassuring that we could practice restraint and learn to live with the atomic bomb, man in the atomic age. But like you said, Anders saw it, the atomic bomb, as this icon of showing how human beings have become obsolete in their ability to live with in an intelligent and sensorily perceptive way with the things they are creating. It's like I said before, we can't know what we're, to use Ivan Illich's phrase, it's a world without sense. It's a senseless world, literally, in the fact that our sensorium, our eyes, our nose, our ears, our taste, our feel, cannot grasp, cannot integrate with it so that we can understand what we're doing. Because understanding comes through the senses.
Right.
In a concrete way, we have lost the ability to understand what we need to do and what we are doing. And that's the sense in which Anders talks about the obsolescence of man. We have made ourselves obsolescent by our creation, by our creations. And we continue to do this. After 20 years of driving an old Honda, I was finally seemed like I needed to get a new car last year. And I would like to buy a car in which, with my hands, I roll down the windows. I do not need an electric motor to roll down the windows. I'm perfectly capable of doing that. And I like the little bit of exercise you get. And then you sense the car when you do the mechanical rotation of the handle on the window. But you cannot buy a car like that anymore.
Right.
And in fact, the windshield wipers are automatically programmed. They have sensors on them. They go on automatically when it rains. I'm not even allowed to turn my windshield wipers on and off anymore. I am obsolescent in my own car. Why does it need me? And in fact, we're going to make driverless cars.
That's right. That's right.
So
it's a bit, even though funny, it's a bit tragic, as you point. I mean, as you're saying this, one realizes the fullness of what's going on. That is to say, the primordial, what this age is, as you were saying earlier regarding the atom bomb, what you have to confront is the fact that we're losing the ability to understand because we're no longer congenital. We're separated from the world. We have no link. We're encased in a sort of technological bubble. And therefore, we have lost the ground from which we could begin to understand or change. Yeah. So I suppose this is as I said, it's a hard pill to swallow, but I think absolutely you would say, for instance, let's make this concrete. Today, now, as you were saying to me in your email, in these dark times, we hear of the news, what's happening in Ukraine and so on. Concretely, it is, following your explanation or suggestion, an occasion to meditate as clearly as possible on the condition that we can't do very much because we've lost our connection to the earth, to the world, to the senses, to the land.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think what you ask us to do is to shed or drop the usual optimistic, pessimistic, realistic, all these terminologies that says, oh no, Karl, this message is too pessimistic and surely there's something else. But rather than thinking through those sort of pre-packaged lenses, to really comprehend the fact that there is the shield between us and the world. And as long as that shield is there, there's very little chance to understand what's going on, much less.
And try to practice reconnecting with the natural world. I can't resist making a little comment about the pandemic.
Yeah.
That I really experienced the pandemic as a blessing and the lockdown as a blessing. I was forced to retreat to my cabin that I have in southern Colorado and live for a full winter, heating by wood, watching the world change. It regrounded me. The reaction that people had against being locked down, I just found sort of bizarre. It was because the lockdown, ironically, it seemed to me, was a door opening to the non-technosphere.
Right.
It was forcing us to go through a door, or inviting us to go through a door, if we were willing to stop going to the grocery store every day, stop going out with people to the bars. And of course, we could turn it into just watching television, but it was really an invitation to live differently.
Right.
And I think that's the real reason for the resistance to it. Because it disrupted the techno-capitalist juggernaut. And I found it welcome. But only for a few people like me, I think, did they find it worthwhile. Even our mutual friend, David Cayley, rebelled against it.
I see, 30 years ago, I was taking your classes when you were here as the head of STS, and marveled and appreciated very much you as a teacher, my teacher. And I see now again why you're so good at what you do, because you raise awareness, you force awareness. And the most, say, for example, now in the case of COVID and the virus, by meditating carefully on the most obvious thing, you raise awareness of the possibility of being aware. Wake up and understand where we are, which is to say, surrounded in a techno bubble. And every chance we get to meditate carefully on that is perhaps freeing. At least one is freed of one's own slavish sort of habitual encasement in it. As always, Karl, I'm encouraged, soberly encouraged, in conversations with you. Thank you again very much for making the time. I know Mary was thrilled to have accidentally met you, and you sparked that play, which she tells me wrote itself in about 2 weeks. Of course, many edits later. And we hope to see you in State College if you can make the time to attend in a couple of weeks or so.
Well, I'm going to try.
All right.
It was I still remember meeting Mary at the Illich conversation that you organized there in State College. So
Yeah.
and I'm grateful for having been there then, have met Mary, and being involved in this marginal way now.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Karl. Bye.